Prison Days, Book 9. Written by Simon King. Narrated by Todd Waites. Here we are, Book 9. My journey through maximum security has certainly entailed a lot of things that, before I turned up here, never considered possible. I mean, unless you see the inside of a prison for yourself, where else have you ever heard of a shit bomb before? I always thought that by changing to night shift, a lot of the incidents I had grown accustomed to would somehow decline. What I mean is, the majority of the prison population is locked up in their cells, sleeping the night away until an officer wakes them for morning muster. But that's not what happened at all. If anything, I found that the incidents increased personally because, for the most part, I was the only one either in the unit or the one responsible for a group of them. From headaches to slash-ups, all the way to heart attacks, I was the one called as a first responder. This leads to a lot of things many people don't consider when signing up for the type of role, like how the incidents affect you, both physically and mentally. The physical injuries officers suffer never make it to the outside world. Sadly, it's only high-profile criminals that seem to make the evening news, with not even officers' deaths given a second thought. Why is that? And when it comes to the emotional impact of seeing these types of incidents, it changes you, and not always for the better. It makes you sit up and take notice when you realize that in reality, when you put on your uniform and head off to work each day, whatever happens will remain with you forever. Whether it's seeing bucket loads of blood, bashings, or your fellow officers assaulted for the mildest of reasons. Back when I first started this job, I was told that every day would be different, and, to a certain extent, they really are. I remember coming home from work and spending hours talking about what I had seen and heard. Whenever I attended family gatherings, or just hanging out with friends, they would surround me and plead for stories. That's one of the reasons I began these books. I saw how much people loved to hear them. But I changed. It wasn't that people lost their interest in the stories and were no longer up for hearing them. I no longer wanted to share them. I stopped talking altogether, wanting to leave the incidents at work where they belonged. I didn't want them to follow me home, because then they would somehow invade the only place where I could get away from them. Does that make sense? Am I the same person I was when I began this journey? In some ways, yes. But in so many other ways, I became a different person entirely. There was something I found during those first few months, and I might have mentioned it before, but this is worth pointing out again, because I think it puts things into perspective for you. When working in a maximum security prison, I feel safer than when I'm out and about in the real world. Stop reading for a moment and see if you can figure out why. I often tell this to people I speak to, and the answer usually makes sense once I explain it. Can you think why? It's quite simple, really. When I'm working in prison, I know who the men walking beside me are. I know they're prisoners, which is why I never turn my back on them. My senses are always on alert, and I'm ready to respond at a moment's notice. But when I'm out in the real world, say, standing in line at the supermarket, I have no idea who is standing behind me. I have no idea who is driving the car in front of me, or who the person walking towards me really is at the park. Think about that the next time you head outside and are waiting in line somewhere. Look at the people around, because every single one of them has a secret. It's just the level of severity that differs. Time to stop rambling and get my butt inside. There's crooks waiting for us, the kind that don't like to be kept waiting. Let's head behind the walls and see what shocking incidents we find this month. Friday, February 1st. Murray North. Of all the units to be rostered in, I had to draw the short straw, and on the first day of the month. The worst part is, I wasn't rostered in the unit at all. When I checked my allocation, I'd been rostered as a patrol officer. It wasn't until I came through the control room airlock that they notified me of the change. Another officer had called in sick, and the supervisor wanted someone experienced in the unit. I wasn't impressed. The unit, the last place I wanted to spend my night. If I can explain the atmosphere to you with the least amount of words, imagine yourself sitting in an empty room. Your chair is located in the very middle, and around the outside of the room, the walls have openings that are covered in grating. Because the rooms behind the grating are dark, you cannot see into them. But the spotlight on you illuminates the area where you sit, and thus they have a very clear view of you. Your job is to simply sit in that chair, while the occupants in the rooms shout abuse at you. The abuse they shout serves two purposes. The first is to go fishing, throwing bait in your direction to see if you bite. There's normally insults, highlighting whether you're fat, skinny, old, young, four-eyed, redhead, bald, or any other number of visual cues. Then there's the insults surrounding your wife, husband, girlfriend, boyfriend, even grandparents and pets. They want to know your breaking point. The second purpose is to have fun. They do it to break up their own boredom, to keep each other entertained, and to see who can throw the funniest insult. After each insult is hurled through the grate, there's accompanying laughter, normally echoed by others in nearby rooms. It feels a little like standing up in front of the school at assembly time without any escape. For many, it comes down to a choice. Firstly, it pays to understand that for the most part, it's not personal. They might see a wedding band and try to focus on that. One of them may overhear a conversation between you and another officer where you discuss family matters, such as children. These guys always listen. They have a lot of spare time on their hands, and they will spend days, weeks, months, and even years to build up a picture of you during that period. You might drop something about your broken-down Ford today, spot a wedding band, hear you moan about the traffic on the way home on such and such road the previous shift. It doesn't take long for these guys to paint a picture of you and your life, knowing which direction you live in, who lives in your home, and which football team you barrack for. And why does all that matter in the first place, I hear you ask? Because that's how they get you. By getting to know certain things about you, they might try and use that against you. I've seen it happen plenty of times, with officers forced to smuggle gear in because someone made a threat against their wife named Nancy, who picks up little Jimmy from such and such a school. And it all starts with sitting in that empty room and seeing at which insults you bite. That's where the choice comes into play. For one, it's important to set yourself a line in the sand. Do you respond to all of the insults, some of them, or none of them? Do you ignore completely, or take certain privileges away with each one? Do you dish out punishment to only the nastiest, or all of them? The one thing I was always told since the very beginning is to be consistent. If you report a crook for one thing, be sure to report them all for the same thing. Don't pick and choose about when you want to punish. That's why I've always tried to be as fair as possible. When it comes to insults, I let them slide, because trying to combat 50 or 60 bored crooks will get you absolutely nowhere. If anything, it will just give them more ammunition, and I can't be bothered with those sorts of games. Remember the old ignore them and they'll give up? It's good advice in this place, because deep inside, they know that I will always hold the upper hand. When they press that intercom button in the middle of the night because they need to take a shit and have run out of paper, it's me that answers that button. I'm the one that serves them breakfast in the morning, hands their laundered clothes back to them when done, and contacts the medical staff if they have a medical issue. So, who's really in control? I see officers give in to the intimidation too often, wanting to take on the entire unit because someone said they wanted to butt-fuck their wife or mother or even their grandmother. The crooks don't even know your family, which gives the comments zero credibility. And just as a side note, if you happen to be offended by those types of comments, I would advise against a career as an officer. To get back on track, I made my way to the unit, greeting several officers on their way out. Khan gives me a fist bump as he passes me with Thelma by his side. According to them, the day had been fairly quiet, apart from a fight in the gym just after lunch. They wish me a good night, and I resume my trek to the unit. Where I would normally hear the shouting and abuse long before I reach the airlock, it seems the heat of the day has taken all the fight out of the unit's occupants. It's virtually silent, the loudest noise coming from the crickets out in the yard. As I step through the door, the sound of industrial fans hits me, with the unit relying on simple fans to keep cool. There are no air conditioners, and I'm grateful for the night shift, the temperature much more bearable during the night. Lynn, normally assigned to the psych unit, is sitting in the station as the other officers rush around trying to finish off their duties before the end of the shift. There's several bags of laundry to finish, most of which I will undertake. There's also a few last-minute handouts, the muster to conduct, plus the final signatures on the 3 watches that I will have the pleasure of monitoring. After dumping my gear, I do what every inquisitive officer does when first entering a unit for night shift, which is to check the roster. It's a good way to prepare yourself for any crap you might foresee, simply by recognizing the names. My eyes scan the list, darting from one line to the next, with my excitement building. The excitement isn't from the names that I do see on the list, but rather from the one name I don't see. "Where's Toby?" I asked, slightly hopeful. "Gone," is the reply, but for some reason, it's as if English has suddenly turned into a foreign language for me. "I'm sorry?" I asked, positive I heard wrong. "He's gone," Lynn repeated. "Released into the custody of some carer." The bemused look on her face told me that I must have appeared goofy in return. "Gone? He's gone?" She nodded. The feeling of relief that washed over me at that moment was indescribable. It was like finding a 50 stashed in the pocket of your pants that you forgot about. "Heard the good news?" Rick said as he came to the station for a toilet roll. "Just did," I replied, the urge to break out into dance still undeniably strong. It doesn't take long for control to call muster correct, and within a few short minutes, the unit is mine, the only sound coming from the single industrial fan still running. It's loud enough to eclipse the noise of 2 running washing machines and a couple of dryers. I stand in the station for a few moments, taking in the underlying silence of the unit. The heat is still quite strong, and I decide to fill my water bottle first. There's a water cooler in the officer's lunchroom, and head there, making sure to keep the door ajar in case someone decides to buzz up. Once done, I return to the station, fire up the computer, and start with the accumulated emails. There's the usual stack of irrelevant ones, my finger working the delete button as I silently discard each. There's things like random announcements, unit allocations for transfers, as well as conversations between supervisors and units that for some reason include me. But the one email I keep my eye out for is the daily incident report. This is the one sent out by the duty supervisor each day, covering all the incidents from the previous day. It's an important email that should be read by every officer to familiarize themselves with events that could bring offenders into their care. For me being in Murray North, a lot of incidents lead to prisoners ending up in here, so it's a good idea for me to know who's newly in and why. The other reason I make sure I read that email is because it is incredibly entertaining. This is where the juice is, the cream of the emails. Sometimes I love nothing more than saving up like a dozen of them and turning the reports into a reading session, almost as if opening the latest John Grisham thriller. The funny thing is, there's no way anybody could ever make this shit up. There's the usual reports of prisoners who tested positive for illicit substances after their urine tests. There's also a few incidents of crooks refusing to follow orders and finding themselves locked down. Then there's the reports of things found by either night patrol staff or day staff conducting random cell searches. Illegal drugs, tobacco, matches, lighters, homemade brew, pornographic material, and medication all feature. There's the occasional shiv, normally found in some random milk carton or in someone's possession. On top of those normal reports, there's those that don't feature all the time. The prisoner-on-prisoner assaults, the assaults on staff, the deaths in custody, plus, on rare occasions, the officers caught doing the wrong thing and being removed from the prison. Like I said, it makes for some wild reading and is the one thing I always give my undivided attention to. The reading, while extremely entertaining, can also be life-saving, especially in here. If I read that someone has been transferred to Murray North for attacking an officer, it gives me the heads up to watch myself when dropping the trap, something I do at least once with every cell during every shift. There's only 4 daily incident report emails for me to peruse tonight, and none of them contain anything overly special. Other than 3 crooks assaulting another prisoner last Wednesday, there's nothing of interest. All 3 are now residents of the very unit I'm sitting in, and I checked the muster sheet to confirm this. They are spread out over the unit. Once finished with the emails, I kill the computer, flick on the television, and start surfing for something worthwhile. But before I get more than 3 channels in, I hear the familiar chiming coming from one of the washing machines. Out of the 3 dryers, only one is still spinning, and once I check the other 2, bag the contents into the washing bags that accompany each load. There's a cell number written in thick black marker on each bag, and it ensures the clothes return to their rightful owners. Once I pack the bags from the 2 dryers, I grab the clothes from the washing machine and transfer them to the dryer, switch it on, and refill the washing machine. The other washing machine has another 10 minutes to run, and thus I grab the newly filled bags and walk them back to their cells. I get to the first, knock on the trap, and then open it up. The crook calls out, and I began jamming the bag through, squishing the top and bottom end to squeeze it through the opening. The crook starts pulling from the other side, and once it pops through, he thanks me. "No problem," I call back, close the trap, and head off to the upstairs recipient of bag 2. Other than hearing a couple of televisions, there's not a lot of life coming from the cells as I pass them, and once I drop off the other bag, return to the station. With no suicide watches, no management watches, and no one buzzing me up, there's not much to do. I return to the television and continue my search, but when I still don't find anything worthwhile after almost 10 minutes of channel hopping, know that the computer is where most of the night will be spent. I have a deadline approaching, and know that time is crucial. Time passes slowly as the heat continues to bite. I pass the final bags of washing through to their recipients a little after 10 and kill the lights once I'm back in the station. As an afterthought, I open one of the doors leading out to the choke pens and feel a coolish breeze almost immediately. The intercom buzzes a few minutes later, and it's a request for the fan to be switched off. The breeze is quite welcoming, and as the fan is quite loud, I'm happy to oblige. I have a couple of smaller fans around the station anyway, and don't really find any difference killing the larger one. Once back in the station, I return to the computer, take a moment to get back into the zone, and then continue to write. My fingers feel almost possessed as I watch them skim across the keys, punching the letters with the words materializing across the screen. Something that has always fascinated me is how my mind can be concentrating on the subject at hand, in this instance writing one of the prison days books, and yet a second idea is slowly forming in some corner of my mind. It's as if I have 2 minds, both engaged with different tasks, each focusing on a particular task and yet completely independent of each other. What I'm thinking about in the back of my mind is whether to release a couple more Prison Days books. It doesn't seem right to finish at 10 when there's 12 months in the year. It's not like I have a shortage of material. I mean, there are such a lot of incidents that I haven't mentioned, and it seems a shame not to continue with the series to at least finish the year out. I guess this is my way of saying, hey, guess what? Prison Days books 11 and 12 are officially announced. I actually pause as I consider the prospect, and once I make the decision, actually find my fingers typing with a newfound enthusiasm. The night continues on, and I'm almost in a zombie-like zone when the intercom goes off again. I check the muster, see the name Doyle next to the cell number, and groan. Yo, I reply, almost sure of what the question will be. Hey boss, am I on the bus? I have a bit of history with this particular crook, back during my first year on the job. I spent the first few weeks working the night shift in the very unit, and Doyle would buzz up each and every night asking whether he was on the bus, as in getting transported out to another prison. Now, normally, you say no without question. The reason you say a standard no is because if you give them the heads up that they're on the bus, they may find a way to get word out, and then family or friends, maybe even associates, could hit the bus and help the crook to escape. At least that's the idea. But during one particular night, one of the supervisors was in the unit when he buzzed. He happened to be standing in the station having a chat with me when the intercom buzzed, and when he heard the name, said that he was on the bus. When I said that I was told not to tell the crooks, the supe told me that it didn't matter after hours. He actually leaned in and answered the intercom himself. It was around 2 the following morning that Doyle buzzed up and claimed to be having chest pains. I found out later that it was all bullshit and just a way for him to avoid the bus. It turned out that he didn't want to leave this prison, and thus tried to manipulate the system. No, Patrick, not on the bus. I cancel the connection and return to my book, noticing the time. Some people are just too easy to predict. Whether he leaves or not, it's not up to me to share the news, and thus never tell them, even if they are in fact on the list. I return to my writing, and am happy to sit out the rest of the night without incident. There's the usual breakfast rounds between 5 and 6, and then the day shift began to arrive not long after. All up, it's a good night, despite the heat. While it was quite hard trying to stay awake in the middle of the night, I managed to keep myself occupied, which is enough to make the night go a little quicker. Not that it matters, because within a few short hours after the end of my shift, I returned to do the whole thing again. Saturday, February 2nd. I love Saturday nights, as it's the only night of the week that truly feels like the weekend for the entire shift. Neither Friday night nor Sunday feel the same, as there's a normal workday on either end. But with Saturday, it's a weekend shift for the entire shift. Tonight, I'm allocated as a patrol officer, and I don't hesitate to get to the soup's office. To my dismay, Catherine Darnell is sitting in the captain's chair, and as per her usual routine, she's allocated everybody's units as well as partners. She's a fairly new addition to the supervisor's pool, and some believe takes her job a little too seriously. Campaspe, Avoca, and Maribinong are my units for the night, and the name next to mine on the roster is one I don't recognize. Houghton is all that's written there, and as I head into the staff room, find out that a new intake graduated the previous day. It turns out that I have a fresh officer partnered with me, meaning I get to show them the ropes. I throw my food in the fridge and head outside to enjoy a few minutes of sunshine before it slips away for another day. It's the quietest moment of the day as most of the yards stand empty, all the crooks already inside and prepping for lockdown. I close my eyes to take full advantage and once again listen to the sounds of the prison around me. "Hi there," a sweet voice speaks close to me, and I open my eyes to see a young woman standing before me, She's tiny, barely standing much taller than the table beside me. Okay, maybe a slight exaggeration, but you get the idea. "Hello," I replied. "Are you Simon?" I nod, and she immediately holds her hand out. "Candace." "From the last intake?" I ask, and it's her turn to nod. "Obvious, huh?" "Well, your shirt is a lot brighter than most," I reply, trying not to sound condescending. "So, what do we do?" We wait. Nothing happens until count is called correct. We could head to one of our units, but chances are the officers are still busy with locking up their unit. "Cool. Mind if I sit?" She drags one of the metal chairs over and sits opposite me. After a few moments of silence, we start the usual train of questions when people first meet. "What did you do before this?" I ask, effectively releasing the brake. "School teacher." "I know, weird, huh?" "Really? What the hell would bring you into a place like this?" Her answer surprised me. Going from where she began to where she was now is like going from champagne and opting for sour milk. "I'd been teaching for 10 years and just needed a change." Far out. That's a hell of a change. Before she has a chance to answer, the radio crackles, as if someone tried to push a button before changing their mind. Candace was about to answer, but I held up a finger and grabbed my radio. I knew what was about to come. "Code Foxtrot, Thompson East," Control called, and I gestured for Candace to follow. We ran to the unit, soon joined by several others as we navigated the corridors. The gate into the compound already stood open, with several officers ahead of us and just making their way through the airlock. The good thing about the airlocks during a code is that Control releases the doors so both can be opened at the same time. It saves a hell of a lot of time when trying to gain access. Just as we reach the airlock ourselves, the radio comes to life again and relays an update, which effectively ends our afternoon run. "No further staff required in Thompson East." I stop running, pause, and hold my hand up as I try to catch my breath. I'm not in the best condition for long-distance jogs, and thus take a moment to find my breath again. Candace watches, a grin forming on her face. "Yes, I'm fat," I wheeze at her. "You're not fat," she replies, and although she's half right, I know I could do with losing a few pounds. "May as well head to the unit," I finally manage, and slowly head back to the compound gate. Avoca is right next door, and I figure it's as good a place as any to wait for the call to start work. Once we reach the unit and make our way to the station, I introduce Candace to the on-duty crew, some of which are already conducting their lockdown count. We spend a few minutes talking shit while watching more and more cells get locked down for the night. A couple of crooks are madly running around trying to finish last-minute chores, and I see Candace watch them wide-eyed, the way most new recruits eye off prisoners. There's a recount called shortly after Brett Smith calls in their number, and a couple of the officers grab the muster board to repeat their previous rounds. "Better not be us," one of the female officers whispers, and it's a perfect thing to hope for. If this is the unit with the wrong count, all officers must remain behind and write a report for the duty supervisor before they can go home. It's enough to add another 30 minutes onto your shift, and at this point in time, nobody wants to remain behind for 30 minutes. Thankfully, count is called correct a few minutes after the numbers are relayed a second time to Control, and it takes all of about 20 seconds for the day shift to vacate the unit. But just as I open my trap to start explaining the process of searching the units to my partner, the radio summons me. "Control to Patrol 2. I'm already shaking my head as I reach for the phone, only too aware of the reason for such an early call. "Hey, Simon, can you and your partner go to Campaspe and get Jones from Cell 44 and take him to medical?" "On our way," I reply, hang up the phone, and turn to Candace. "We have a medical escort next door. Late medication." "What does that mean?" she asks, following me back to the airlock. "Guy was probably at a visit or something when meds came around to the unit. It's pretty common." Weekends are notorious for visits, and while the medical trolleys make their rounds to each of the units, prisoners may miss their meds because of the time clash. It's not really anybody's fault and just leaves us with extra duties. The way I see it, we get paid for our shift, and if walking prisoners up to get their meds is part of it, then so be it. As we enter Campaspe, the smell of rotten produce hits us hard, and I look at Candace, whose face instantly screws up at the stench. "Welcome to Campaspe," I snort, as she looks as if she's about to start retching. "What the hell is that?" "That's the smell of prison," I reply, and head for the station. I point to the logbook and gesture for Candace to sit and fill it out. As she is new, I make her the point person in our team, which gives her the lead for the night. It's the best way for her to pick up as much as possible, and will hopefully make her life a little easier as her career advances. Once she's filled out the name, prisoner number, and time under the log, we make our way up the stairs into the cell. Just before we reach it, I pause. Drop the trap, ask if he's going to get his meds, then make sure he has his ID card. Then slap the cuffs on his wrists and I'll unlock the cell. She looks back at me nervously, and I can see the shock in her eyes. Have to do it sometime, may as well be now. I follow Candace to the cell door and watch as she drops the trap. Like a true veteran, she comes in slowly from the side instead of jamming her face into the trap's opening immediately. "Jones?" Pause. "Ready to get your meds?" Another pause. A murmur from inside. "Got your ID?" Another pause. "Okay, cool. Chuck your hands through. Have to cuff you." "Why? They didn't cuff me last night." I watch as Candace's face gains color, but like a true professional, doesn't flinch, answering the prisoner like a 10-year veteran. "It's after lockdown. If they didn't cuff you last night, then you had a win. Tonight's soup isn't as forgiving." Jones reaches his hands through the opening, and Candace slaps the cuffs on, ensures there's enough space between wrist and metal, then locks them into place. Once the trap is closed, I unlock the cell door and swing it open. "Let's go, man." It's a brief walk to the medical unit, and once there, we wait for the nurse to do his thing. It's a standard interaction, and as we watch our prisoner get dosed, another crew walk in with their own escort, this one from Thompson West. It's nothing more than a nod of acknowledgement to the other officers before we head back to the unit. The whole affair takes about 10 minutes, and once Jones is locked safely back into a cell, Candace fills the logbook out a second time. I restart my previous speech and begin to explain the searching process and throw in a little tips for her to consider. One big tip is something that a lot of new recruits tend to forget, and the mistake can lead to a very unpleasant 3 months. Never put your fingers where you can't see them, is what I tell her. Yes, we wear gloves, but needle stick injuries are more common than any other type of injury for officers, normally received when someone runs their fingers along hiding places. Getting a needle prick may not be a significant injury, but when you consider the fact that hepatitis, AIDS, and a whole host of blood-borne diseases exist in these very units, you quickly learn to take care of yourself. If you do receive a needle stick injury, there's a 12-week wait before you find out whether you acquired a disease from the injury. 12 weeks of not being able to kiss your wife or partner, no intimacy, and the question hanging over you. When it comes to searching the units, it is the very first thing I try and get through to new recruits. The rest of the advice is more to do with where to look, including some of the ingenious locations prisoners tend to hide their wares. Candace is a quick learner and does me the courtesy of paying attention before putting the skills to use. Despite trying our best, we turn up nothing after searching all 3 units. We even spend extra time in Avoca, going through the common area with a fine-tooth comb, but in the end, there was nothing to find. We return to the staff room and I meet a couple of other new officers. There's a bit of banter between the new recruits, and it's fun to listen to as we pass the night. Apart from a few boring movies on the tube, there's very little else to keep us interested. With no codes throughout the night, plus no court attendees to escort on a Sunday morning, it doesn't make for very interesting reading. Sunday, February 3rd. Darnell is again in the captain's chair, and as if trying to keep things as they were, I find myself partnered with Candace for a second night, although this time looking after Thompson East, West, as well as Tambo East. These three units tend to be at the rougher end of the spectrum, although this isn't something that is set in stone. Units don't always remain rough, or quiet, or one of the normal ones most people like to work in. The reason for this is that units always have a turnover of residents. While some units hold long-termers, there are also a lot of short stays, temporary residents, plus those who need to be moved for other reasons. I dump my gear in the staff room and immediately head to Tambo East. I noticed a familiar name on the duty roster and am keen for a quick catch-up before he heads home. Given that we now work on opposite sides of the day, catching up with friends isn't something that happens a lot. Russell Rawlsley is sitting in the station as I come through the airlock, while the rest of the crew are prepping for the end of shift. "Hey, stranger," Russ calls out, and we shake once I reach the station. It has been quite a few weeks since I've had a chance to chat with him. "How's nights working out for you?" "Nights are great. Hardly any codes in recent weeks, which is good." "Geez, don't say that too loud," he laughs at me, and I slap a hand over my mouth, only too aware of the possibility of jinxing myself. We chat about things like old mates normally do, asking about each other's families and that kind of thing. The others continue to lock the unit down, and soon two of them start the count process. "Patrol 4 to Patrol 5, my radio blurts out, and I answer, telling Candace of my location. It doesn't take long for her to join us, looking a little more relaxed than the previous evening. It always amazes me with how quickly people tend to adapt to the role. I don't mean how they deal with specific situations, but rather just relaxing in the prison as a whole once they experienced a day here or there. Sadly, it's one of the fastest ways to forget where you are, and I make a mental note to share this with Candace. There's one thing I still do every shift, and it comes at a certain point when I enter the prison. The moment I attach the keys to my chain, I remind myself of the words I'd been told years before. They decide if you go home. They are the words I wear on my shoulder, because they are the fundamental rule in this place. They mean that no matter what, remember who they are, remember where you are, and remember who you are. Officers often forget that they are not stab-proof. They do not have the right to treat people like shit simply because they wear a uniform. In the end, the uniform means nothing without a personal sense of duty to do the right thing. Too many officers fall into the trap of either forgetting where they are, or worse, trying to play the big bad officer because of their own ego. I've seen what happens to officers who are the latter type. They end up hurt, and sometimes severe enough to cause permanent damage. And sometimes others are also hurt because of their need to step in and protect. The actions of one can and do affect many at times. Count doesn't take long to be called correct, and with a final goodbye, the unit is once again empty of staff, save for my partner and I. Before I forget my thoughts, I share them with Candace, but not in a way that makes me sound like a preacher. The last thing I want is to sound like a pompous twit trying to big note himself. Instead, I put it into story form and share it in a way that she listens to with interest. Once done, we set about searching the unit. I start with the kitchen, while Candace takes upstairs, plus the chook pen. The usual unit noises surround us as we conduct our business, with televisions and stereos filling the air. We head to Thompson West next, which sits opposite Tambo, and continue our search. It's just a repeat of the previous unit, and apart from a small bottle of homebrew, find nothing of interest. I give Candace the bottle of brew to check out, so she knows what to look for. She screws her face up at the smell, which is somewhat similar to a mix of rotten orange juice and vomit. The vomit smell, the more powerful of the two. You don't report it? Not always. It's an insignificant amount. Plus, it's in the common area. Which means you'd never find the owner, she adds. Exactly. Not worth the time. We head off to Thompson East once finished, and this time hit pay dirt. Candace takes one of the fridges and discovers a decent-sized shiv hidden inside a milk carton. It's wrapped up in toilet paper, and once we finish the rest of our searching, take the offending milk carton back to the soup's office. Thompson West doesn't offer up anything either, which leaves us with just the shiv to report. Darnell isn't around, no doubt off on her own rounds. To quicken the process up, I grab an evidence bag and show Candace how to fill it out, then add the bag's identification number to the register. The barcode sticker is added to the book, as well as the details of the find. Once finished, we hit the switch on the computer, wait for it to fire up, then bring up a blank report form. I take my partner through the form, showing her which bits need filling out, how to properly word things, and which to forget completely. She catches on quick, and by the time Darnell finally shows up, we have everything printed out and ready to go. Nice find, the supervisor says, as Candace unwraps the shiv for a second time. It's quite a decent size, maybe 8 inches long. It's made up of a piece of sheet metal that's been ground down to a point. The other end is wrapped in cloth and rubber bands, making for a decent handle. The weapon is significant, the blade long enough to cause serious damage. Thank you, Candace replies. Darnell takes the photos she needs, then hands us back the weapon, which we seal into the evidence bag. We walk it over to the next building, where the intelligence department is located, and place the evidence bag into the appropriate locker, then add the details to their register. All up, it takes about an hour from find to final register entry. It's time well spent, and once we head back to the staff room, Candace shares her find with a couple of other newbies from her course. They sit around near the back of the room, talking excitedly about their new roles. The night progresses, and we have a single-code mic just after midnight. It's a diabetic with a low blood sugar level, and it doesn't take much to bring him back to normal. Once we return to the staff room, everyone takes up their previous positions and goes back to what they were doing. Our morning restarts just after 5, with several prisoners needing escorts up to admissions. We have 3 from Thompson East and 3 from Tambo East. It doesn't take long for us to walk the first group up and drop them off into a holding cell before heading back for the second lot. It's a simple enough process, with Candace filling out the details in the unit log while I go to the cells and unlock them. The first one is still brushing his teeth, so I head to the second door. That crook greets me and heads downstairs as I continue to the third one. He's also ready, and once I lock his cell door again, return to the first. As the final one joins the other 2, there's the usual high fives and pats on the back. It's almost as if they haven't seen each other in weeks. They talk about the day ahead as we head off through the airlock, each hoping for bail or release. Once we get back to admissions and drop them into the holding area, Candace and I walk around to where the processing is taking place. There's already a good number of officers helping out, and so I lead my partner through to the back of the building to where the transportation buses are beginning to pull in. It's as good a place as any to spend the final hour of our shift, making numbers as the transportation officers and admission staff begin loading. One officer opens the appropriate holding cells to release each wanted prisoner in turn, takes them to the driver to be ID'd, then walk to the bus. The buses aren't what you might expect. They don't look like ordinary buses, instead resembling horse transports. They have a number of small doors around the outside, with a tiny window set high into each. The doors have both an inner one and an outer one, with the inner one being the cell door, complete with a small trap, viewing window, and made of heavy steel. The outer door is more for protection of the general public, hiding the inner door with a simple plain white door. Unless you knew what the buses were, you'd probably never even notice them, let alone know what they held behind the doors. The inside of the cells have either a single bench seat or two bench seats facing each other. Located on the ceiling above the seats is a camera, a speaker leash, and an emergency button. The button is similar to what's located in prison cells, acting like an intercom with the drivers. Crooks often go nuts and repeatedly press the button if they want to be dicks. Candace and I stand near the buses and keep an eye on the prisoners as they are walked out one at a time. Just as they are separated in admissions due to their unit allocation, they're also separated on the buses, with each cell holding between 2 and 4 crooks. Most regular buses have 4 cells, holding 16 crooks in total, but a couple of the bigger ones hold as many as 30, spread out amongst 8 cells. The whole loading process takes around 40 minutes, and once we watch the last one climb aboard and get sealed in, return to the staff room for our gear, then make our way out to the front door. I thank Candace for a great couple of nights and wish her well. For me, it's the final shift before a nice break of 7 nights. Thursday, February 7th. Ended up putting my name down for some overtime, as I could do with an extra kick in my pay packet. It paid off and I was called 10 minutes before the start of shift, allocated to Yarra North for the day. Working in this unit can be good, while at other times leaving you wanting to tear your own ear off. It really depends on the crew you work with. While Thelma is the escorting officer, I also have one newbie on the team, a woman named Deidre Seller, plus a regular named Emilio Talbot. The latter is an officer that has been in the prison for almost a decade, a middle-aged Mexican with a fiery temper. He doesn't take a lot of shit and is quick to dish out punishment. But oddly enough, Emilio is also one of the quietest officers I know, often just sitting in the station, cup of tea in hand, and watching the unit across the rim of his drink. After the initial greetings are out of the way, I hand the muster board to Deidre and ask if she wants to accompany me on morning trap count. She takes the board hesitantly, but is keen to learn. We reach the first cell and I drop the trap, peering inside to make out the shapes lying in the bunks. It's a dual occupancy cell, and when I call out for movement, both crooks throw me a wave. 2, I tell Deidre, who writes the number next to the cell. Continuing on, I drop each trap in turn and call for movement. Sometimes they wave without needing a prod, other times the snores are so loud I have to shout to get a response. Occasionally, I'm treated to something extra special, instead of a simple wave. "Fuck off, you mutt," is thrown a couple of times, as well as the random dog. Does it bother me? Hell no. I need a response, and if that's what you do to let me know you're alive, then so be it. Could I take action? Of course, but why would I want to? It just adds grief and could even turn into something much more significant. Most of the time, it's just crooks being crooks. Some will even come up later to apologize, especially if they need something done. Deidre has a giggle each time an insult is thrown out, and for the final couple of cells, we switch roles, giving her a chance to experience opening a cell trap. "Who's in here?" she asks as we head back to the station. Mostly sex predators, but also a couple of old-school serial killers and a few rats. Rats? Talkers, laggers, those that like to win points by telling us secrets. Oh, those. We add up the numbers together, and once we have our total, I make sure to compare the number up with what's in the log. If count was called correct the previous night, then the previous evening's final tally is the start for today. 2 crooks were escorted up for court, giving us a starting count of 2 less than the previous shift's final number 59. 57. Deidre phones through to control once they announce the commencement of muster, and when she hangs up, we sit around and talk a bit of shit. Thelma returns a few moments later, carrying a tray of cups for the crew, and we sip the coffees and teas while we wait. There's more chit-chat, most of it questions for Deidre about her own background. She used to be a librarian and was looking for a bit more adventure in her life, and it's enough for the rest of us to have a giggle. She certainly came to the right place for adventure. It's just before 8 when control calls count correct, and Deidre and I share the burden of unlock. I take the top tier while she unlocks the bottom cells, working her way from one to the next with each turn of the key. I can only imagine how simple life must be in a prison where everything is electronically controlled. The prisoners begin to emerge from their cells, the relative silence of the unit quickly evaporating in a rising tide of voices. Several head to the breakfast bench for toast and coffee, while others detour to the laundry area to drop their bags off. A single prisoner is allocated as the unit's laundry billet, and he's the one to keep the machines fed each day. Deidre and I return to the station as a row of prisoners awaits help with various requests. Several ask when the gym will be open, as Thursday is Protection Day, while others ask for forms and other items, such as sponges and cleaning products. This is the busiest time, with one officer allocated to filling out the log with all movements. Thelma quickly takes her first escort, a crook needing to go to medical for an appointment. There will be a lot more for her to come, with escorts needing to be made for unit transfers, prison transfers, medical and educational appointments, as well as court appointments which are held in a building on the other side of the prison. The morning continues on, and apart from showing Deidre the ropes with medical trolleys and random tier walks, there's not a lot to say. Time flies, and before we know it, lunchtime muster is called. Emilio calls for the prisoners to line up by their doors for count, and we wait for them to comply. This time, Emilio takes the muster board around, while Deidre and I grab little slips of paper and conduct our own counts from the middle of the common area. It takes a few minutes to get the right number, with unit deathly silent as Emilio slowly makes his way along each row of cells. The prisoners stand by their open doors, all eyeing us as we try and come up with the same number. There's the occasional snicker, a cough here and there, but other than that, nothing unusual. That is, until Emilio gets to cell 42. He pauses and stares in through the open door. A crook appears a few seconds later and resumes his place by the doorframe. I see Emilio whisper something to him, then continue on along the tier. "No, you're not," the crook suddenly calls out, and Emilio stops and looks back over his shoulder. He eyeballs the prisoner for a few minutes, but doesn't speak, finally continuing on. Deidre comes up behind me, and I turn to check out her tally. She shows me her number, and I see she has one less than me. "Did you count the guy in the kitchen?" I ask. Because lunch is served immediately after count is called correct, the kitchen billet remains in the kitchen to continue preparing the meal. It's a matter of reheating whatever the kitchen sent up via the meal trolley and takes the billet a good hour to prep. "Oh, no I didn't," she replied, and I nod. It's not uncommon to miss him. "Break off," Emilio calls as he passes the final cell, and the prisoners make a mad dash for the kitchen serving window, forming a line in front of the Baie Marie. Just as I had hoped, once Deidre added the kitchen billet, we had 3 totals, all matching. Once control calls for the numbers, Emilio phones it in, and we watch the prisoners get their lunch, then retreat either to their cells or to one of the large tables scattered around the common area. Each table has 6 seats attached to it, and they normally fill as the inmates eat together. You can normally tell how tasty the food is by the amount of chatter. The unit is in near silence, and I figure the sausage rolls and salads they're eating must be quite good. I've tasted the sausage rolls and know they're up there as far as prison food goes. "What happened over there?" I ask Emilio, nodding up to where the crook was in his cell. "Cunt was watching TV during count. I told him I was taking his TV for the rest of the day. It's a common enough punishment for that particular offense, and agree with him. Count is called correct a few minutes later, and we settle in for the first part of the afternoon, normally involving the prisoners getting into either a game of pool, table tennis, or even a card game or two. For us, there's a couple of random searches to do, a few more tier walks, plus prepping a cell for a new arrival. It's just enough to keep us busy without overwhelming us. And with 3 officers who don't mind sharing the load, it's a decent afternoon. Or it would have been if things had gone as we hoped. It was a little after 2 when Emilio leaned into the microphone, activated the unit's loudspeaker, and called for Dewin to come to the station. He snapped the button to cancel it again, then sat back, his head turned up to where the previous incident had taken place. "Think he'll just bring it down?" Deidre asked. "That's his choice, but one way or the other, that television is coming down." It only took a few seconds for Dewin to appear, walking towards the stairs empty-handed. It appeared that he wasn't going to give up his entertainment willingly. "I'm not bringing my TV," he said as he approached the station. "You don't have a choice," Emilio said calmly. "Fuck that. I didn't hear the muster. I came out when you asked, and that should be it." "Everyone else heard it. Go get your television." "I'm not asking. I'm ordering." I could sense the tension build as the rest of the unit grew silent, all eyes turning towards the confrontation. If there's one thing you never want to miss in jail, it's the signals of shit about to happen. Deidre was still sitting in her seat, and I leaned in to pre-warn her. "If anything happens, grab your radio, press the button, and call a code Alpha." She looked back at me nervously, but as if to acknowledge me, pulled her radio from its clip and held it in her lap. Dewin turned back and began to walk back to the stairs. Just before he reached them, he looked over his shoulder and called, "Fuck you, dog." It was all it took for Emilio to get to his feet. "You're locked down for the rest of the day. Back to your cell," Emilio shouted and made a beeline for the crook. Instead of following the instruction, Dewin turned and walked towards the pool table. He didn't appear to head directly towards it, just sort of walking towards wherever he wasn't supposed to. Crooks began to line the top-tier railing, all watching for what was about to happen. The thing is, this is where you know it matters. Not so much for the action, but rather more from the prisoner's point of view. They're watching to see what happens. I didn't doubt for a second that some of them would be watching the new officer in the unit to see whether she responds. As if sensing this, I turned to look at the station and saw Deidre already on her feet, the radio held up beside her shoulder at the ready. Emilio continued following Dewin, shouting for him to lock down. I kept my distance, but remained close enough to offer backup should he need it. This situation could get out of hand if other prisoners decided to join in and make an event out of it. Emilio continued calling for Dewin to lock down, but the crook was having none of it. Thankfully, there'd been no match played on the pool table at that moment. Otherwise, it would have offered Dewin more than a dozen missiles to launch at us. "Get your fucking arse up to your cell," Emilio called again, and this time Dewin stopped and turned. I was expecting him to maybe charge, but instead, he stood frozen, waiting for Emilio to close in. I'm not sure why he did, but rather than keep his distance and try to de-escalate the situation, Emilio didn't pause, walked right up to the prisoner and grabbed his shirt. "Let's go," he snarled. Dewin tried to pull away from the officer, maybe to simply release himself, but Emilio hung on and somehow lost his balance. To try and catch it, he swung out as he fell, reaching for the prisoner's shirt front. At the same time, Dewin went to sidestep away from the officer, but because Emilio was already falling in the same direction, the pair somehow became entangled. Their legs intertwined, caught each other mid-step, and the pair fell forward in a mass of swinging arms and locked-up legs. Behind me, I heard Deidre first call the code over the radio and then thankfully call for the unit to lock down. As I rushed to where the two bodies were wrestling with each other, I heard the cheer go up from the peanut gallery, the crooks up on the tier cheering for a good show. Doohan was bleeding from the lip by the time I reached them and grabbed one of his wrists. "Nathan, just stop," I called, but I'm not sure whether he heard me. What I did hear was Emilio groaning in pain. He rolled away from us once, grabbed his shoulder, and winced as he lay on the dirty carpet. Doohan also stopped, got to his knees, and locked eyes with me. For the briefest moment, I thought he was going to come at me, but then he simply shook his head and walked to the nearest table. He sat as the first officers began to come through the airlock, and within a few short seconds, Doohan was cuffed. Emilio had broken his shoulder as he hit the ground, and when Doohan landed almost on top of him, had added a couple of torn ligaments to the injury. An ambulance was called, but rather than get himself stretchered out of the unit, the old horse walked out under his own steam, refusing any help. Not while the prisoners could see him anyway. Once he had been taken up to medical, Emilio was taken to hospital where he ended up remaining for the next 6 days. I didn't know it at the time, but another officer later told me that Emilio had broken his other shoulder about 8 years ago, in very similar circumstances. My afternoon ended up including an incident report for the confrontation, plus another when I found a toothbrush shiv during one of the cell searches. Deidre helped me with him after a replacement arrived for Emilio, and although she couldn't stand in the cell for the stripping part, she did get her hands into the actual search itself. Despite being an overtime shift, it felt good to be working a day shift again. I saw a lot of familiar faces, and it was great to catch up with people I hadn't seen in some time. The response was great when Deidre called the code, and as always, the rest of the officers did their best to offer backup as quickly as humanly possible. I walked out of the prison with the rest of the crew at the completion of our shift and felt really good. Whilst Emilio's injury was quite bad, it was good that there were no other injuries. Plus, he walked out of the unit himself. He did make a speedy recovery and eventually returned to work some 5 weeks later. Monday, February 11th. The first of 2 shifts, and after a brief break, feel quite rejuvenated as I make my way back into the prison. I'm allocated the Patrol 5 position, and to my surprise, find Darnell in charge again, herself on an overtime shift. My units for the evening include Kempaspe, Avoca, and Maribyrnong, and once again, the name next to mine is not one I recognize, although Spiteri does have a certain familiarity about it. After dropping my gear off in the staff room, I head back to admissions to check on how the transfers and court returns are going. Mondays tend to be a lot busier than other evenings, and I find the place abuzz with activity. I find Chris on the book, and he tells me that there are still a dozen or so court returns, plus a bus from another prison carrying 5 transfers. 4 of the 5 are headed for Avoca, and I make a mental note to check the unit ahead of time. After-hours transfers can at times be quite painful, and it has nothing to do with them arriving as such, instead, often made harder by the day staff. I've performed a ton of after-hours escorts of new arrivals, and one of the worst parts of the process is when the officers on day staff neglect to organize the cells for the new prisoners. There have been times when their cells have stood empty without even a mattress inside, nor any bedding allocated. It makes it hard when trying to find those things when everything is locked up, and I've been known to obtain mattresses from adjoining units. Belle Spiteri rolls in a few minutes before control calls for muster, and we go through the normal introductions. I'm in the middle of helping admissions staff with strips and processing prisoners, and arrange to meet her back at admissions once count is called correct. The final bus barely makes it in before the front is sealed for count, and as soon as they call muster correct, we process the prisoners as quickly as possible. There are still a few court returns to walk back before the transfers will be ready, so I grab a couple once Belle returns and we walk them back to their unit. It's a simple enough process, with Belle entering them in the log, while I return them to their cell. Thankfully, the kitchen billet left their dinner on the bain-marie, and it's just a few seconds more for them to zap it in the microwave. Once they're locked away for the night, we return to admissions and find 2 of the new arrivals ready to go, so we don't hesitate and head straight back out. "We can do our search while we wait for the others to get ready," I said to my partner as we head to Avoca. She nods and unlocks the gate into the compound. I lead the group through the airlock, head to the station, and find the muster, rattling off the allocated cell numbers. Turns out they have their own cell, and to my delight, once I unlock the door, find everything set up, including a bag of bedding already sitting on the floor for each prisoner. After we lock them in, I return to the station, jot down the other 2 cell numbers in my notepad, and follow Belle back out of the unit. She's quite talkative, and it doesn't take long for me to find out why her name is familiar. Her husband works in one of the units. I barely know the guy, but have certainly heard his name before. She had been a housewife and decided to try her hand at the business now that her youngest was in school. As we head back to admissions, the radio goes off, with control calling for me to phone them. "Call you in 2, I reply, then continue on to my destination. It turns out to be a request for a checkup of a prisoner in Campaspe. He had apparently buzzed up a number of times and asked for medical help, but as he has had a history of making false claims, control would prefer me to double-check on him. We turn back and head to the unit, with the other 2 transfers still waiting to speak with a psych nurse. It's not a far walk, and we pass a couple of other patrol staff along the way. Once in the unit, we head up to the top tier, go to the door, and drop the trap. The prisoner, a guy named Tom Sheridan, is lying on his bunk and looks up at me. "I can't move. My legs feel all numb, boss." "Have you had this before?" I ask, and he shakes his head. I see fear in his eyes and doubt he's making it up. "Need to call the code. Sit tight," I said, and leave the trap open as I head back down the stairs. "Can you call a code? I'll let admissions know we'll be a while." Belle looks at me and shakes her head. "I'm not calling a code. Fuck that." Her reply takes me by surprise, and I stop halfway down the stairs. "He needs a code called." "Yeah, but if I call it, I have to do the report." "And it'll be good practice." "Nah, I'm not calling it. You want to call it? You call it." I was floored. She didn't want to call the code because it meant she would have to type up a brief 2-minute report. Not wanting to waste time, I grabbed my radio and called the code mic, then phoned admissions. Instead of returning to the trap, I called for her to remain by the door, then turned on the computer. The first officers arrived within 2 to 3 minutes, the soup after 5. Around a minute after the soup walked in, the nurses arrived, and it was at that moment that I finished the report and emailed it through to the soup. I followed the nurses up the stairs, and as they walked in, told the soup her report was already emailed, making sure to say it loud enough for Belle to hear. Darnell thanked me, and I walked over to where a couple of patrol staff were standing around talking shit. I didn't speak, but instead just listened. Inside, I was furious. Some people's laziness just continued to surprise me, regardless of how much I aged. It turned out that the prisoner had actually urinated in his bed, unable to move due to a spinal injury. He had fallen in the shower earlier in the day and hurt his spine, but for some reason failed to report it. It may have been an assault, but unless he was prepared to share that information, there wasn't a lot anyone could do. We end up waiting for the nurses to get an ambulance crew into the unit, together with a spinal injury board. It's designed to support a patient with a suspected back injury until they reach hospital. The prisoner remains on his bed until the paramedics arrive some 20 minutes later. Belle hangs around the cell door, and I wonder whether she has second thoughts about her attitude towards the need to call codes regardless of subsequent reports. It's a sign of laziness, and one that could spell trouble in her future. Once the ambulance crew arrive, they spend a few minutes fitting the spinal board around the prisoner, then carrying him out. A couple of officers help carry the patient down the stairs, then follow the crew out and back to their waiting ambulance. Seeing the time is already after 9, I phone admissions and get no answer. Just to be sure, I phone control and find out that the crew from admissions left the prison 10 minutes prior, which means the final crooks have been delivered to Avoca for us. We start our search once the unit is empty again, then make our way over to Avoca. Upon checking the logbook, I find the new arrivals entered into it and continue searching. Belle seems very disinterested in the whole thing, and it does little to inspire me to help her. Once we finish all of our searching, we return to the staff room and chill for the rest of the night. My partner heads out to visit a friend manning a unit an hour later, and I don't see her again until the morning when I call her up on the radio around 5:30. It takes a couple of calls, but she finally answers and we meet in Avoca a few minutes later. How many? 6. 3 from here and 3 from next door, I reply, looking at the movement allocation sheet. And then she says something that shouldn't have surprised me. Are we taking them all at once? No. We'll take the first 3, then come back for the second lot. I didn't think it was rocket science. Why don't we just take them all, save from walking all the way back here? Because these guys are separated from each other for a reason? You see these fences? Yeah, but we did the last night I worked. We had a couple from each unit, and my partner just took me into each unit, and we walked them all up at once. And what happens if things kick off? They won't. There is no way I'm mixing prisoners. She actually threw her arms in the air as if I was adding 10 hours to her shift. For fuck's sake, I'm not doing it. I'm not coming back here. I was starting to get frustrated, and she knew it. Okay, so don't. Stay up in admissions, and I'll find someone else to come get the second lot. I had enough. The sad reality, though, was that people actually did what she said. Officers take shortcuts all the time because of simple laziness, and it puts people at risk, particularly new and impressionable officers. Why do they do it? For some, it's just pure and simple laziness, not wanting to do the work. They would happily sit in the staff room for as long as possible without helping. It was those exact officers that began their shift precisely on time, plus returned to the staff room as soon as they could, not bothering to help out in admissions either in the evening or during the morning. The second reason they do it is to make themselves out to be the cool kids of the place. You know the type. Break a few rules, don the dark sunglasses, and hang a cigarette out from the corner of their mouth. A picture of cool. But in reality, the prison isolates crooks for a reason, mostly because of gang affiliations, debts, and sometimes because of prisoners being co-accused. The latter type are normally separated so they cannot converse one-on-one before their court case. Putting them together goes against court orders and could jeopardize an entire case. Like I said, shortcuts that jeopardize people's careers and lives. We're talking members of opposing outlaw motorcycle gangs, some of whom consider themselves at war. There's drug pushers and victims, those who owe debts and those who own debts, plus victims of crime whose tormentors could be living in the unit next to them. The truth is, 1,000 reasons exist not to mix prisoners from different units, and it goes a lot deeper than a lot of officers realize or bother to understand. A whole host of databases keep the information stored, linking some crooks to others and flagging any possible issues, which is how their initial unit classification is chosen. Belle is just lazy and couldn't care less if anything was to happen. She has seen a way of shortcutting the process, thanks to an officer who shares her outlook. As much as I hope to change her opinion, I know there's very little chance, because the next time she's partnered with another shortcutter, there won't be much resistance from her. She does end up returning with me for the second lot, and although I try to explain the reasons, her lack of interest quickly tells me she'd rather hang around the cool kids. I don't care. As long as I continue to do my job correctly, that's all that matters to me. And besides, it's not like we have time constraints. We pick up morning prisoners a good 2 hours before the end of our shift, which is more than enough time to get shit done. The rest of our morning is spent separately, with me remaining in admissions and helping load buses while Belle returned to the staff room. I saw her briefly as we walked out of the prison, but the sunshine and the fact our shift had ended were enough to keep my spirits high and on focus for home. Tuesday, February 12th. Expected to be on patrol again, but as I came through control, was given the keys to Macquarie and instructions to head to the unit and speak to the soup down there. Whilst Macquarie wasn't a normal manned unit at night, I knew there was one reason why someone would be allocated to the unit: a suicide watch. Helen Dunn was waiting for me and gave me the lowdown on just what I was doing there. It turns out that a prisoner by the name of Brian Boyd had been threatening suicide, and as there was a shortage of cells in the manned units, management decided to keep him in his own unit, albeit in an observation cell. Boyd has a significant history of sex crimes against children. His mental age is around 14, and being in the body of a 48-year-old man, it doesn't make life easy for him. Helen gives me a very quick rundown of his family life, but it's not really anything I need to know. The unit has quite a high percentage of mentally challenged prisoners, as well as a number of others who act as minders. Crooks like Toby Manning and John Burns are regular customers in here. There have been previous instances of me doing nights and even days while assigned to look after a single prisoner, so this allocation isn't anything unusual. To my delight, Tony Malone is one of the day staff, and as I return to the station, Sean Banks rolls his eyes at me. It's all I need to understand his point and look up to see Tony arguing with a crook up on the top tier. "Never change," he whispers at me, and I give him a slap on the back. "Glad it's you and not me," I reply, and take a seat by the monitors. I watch as the staff prep the unit for lockdown, with some of the usual running around continuing after Sean calls for everyone to stand by their doors. He has to shout a second request before they appear to comply. Tony returns to the station, gives me a very flat hello, and grabs the muster board. He looks at it for a moment, reads something under his breath, and reaches for his pen. "Who's coming?" "I'll go," I offer, then follow as Tony takes lead and starts going cell to cell. I lock each door, wishing the cell's lone occupants a good night. The unit is locked down in under 10 minutes, and the noise level instantly drops to a more suitable volume. There's a few stereos playing around the place, plus a television here and there. But for the most part, the unit is quiet, perfect for the start of a shift. I check back on Boyd, find him reading a book, and leave him alone. The outer door to his observation cell is still open, and I can make out his shape on the bed through the inner door. As the rest of the crew prepare to go home, I grab the suicide plan for him and have a read. He'd only been placed on suicide watch that morning after his mother canceled a visit. He had been looking forward to seeing her, as she hadn't been by the prison in almost 3 months. Like I said, he had the mental age of a 14-year-old, and he needed to see his mummy. When she canceled for whatever reason, it affected him in a way many of us couldn't understand. But rather than deal with his anger, he grabbed a plastic knife and began to saw the broken edge through his leg, deep enough to get a handful of stitches. What Boyd loved more than anything were books, and it was the one thing he was allowed to have. He was only on S3 with an hourly watch plan, with the nurse just wanting someone to keep an eye on him for the night. It was noted in the plan that he would be reassessed in the morning and most likely return to a normal regime. The day crew left in the blink of an eye once control called count correct, and I set myself up in the station. The computer was all I needed, with the screen right next to the OBSO's monitors. It wasn't long before I was tapping away at the keys, not any specific book, but instead on several ideas that had crossed my mind. Whilst I love these real-life books, I also have a fascination with fiction, in particular, the kind of fiction that delves into what-if situations. It is those kinds of ideas that often cross my mind, and believe, unless I write them down, they tend to disappear and never return. Boyd doesn't make contact at all during the night. One minute his cell was bathed in the evening sun, giving him enough light to read. The next it's bathed in shadows and he appears asleep. I head to his cell door each hour and shine my torch in briefly through the trap, watch for the rise and fall of his breath, then return to my spot in the station, continuing on with first chapters of ideas. Basic outlines, and sometimes just an ending I think would be exciting to turn into a story. There's a code mic called by one of the other manned units around 1 a.m, but the chatter on the radio is brief and not very informative. The night soup drops by around 2, signs my paperwork, and wishes me a good morning before disappearing back into the night. It's not much of a night, and without anything to do to prep the unit for the incoming staff, it's just a matter of waiting for them. And once the first arrive, I head back out towards the 3-day break. Pretty tough, huh? Thursday, February 14th. Today I'm back for another day shift, but this one is definitely not your regular run-of-the-mill workday. It's a training day for me, and not one I'd been looking forward to. If it had been just another first aid day or firefighting course, it would have been okay. But instead, I have the pleasure of weapons training. By weapons, I'm not talking firearms. It's baton and spray training. And by spray, I'm talking pepper spray. Firstly, the training is completely voluntary as it's only needed by those working certain roles within the prison. Secondly, it's a 2-day course, with the first spent on baton training, while the second is all about the spray, and can you guess how it finishes? It's a class of around 20, and we begin as we do all our training, with a lot of the written stuff getting dealt with first. Theory is one of the areas the prison takes serious, and thus it pays to have a firm understanding of the rules and regulations beforehand. We spend almost 2 hours going through papers, signing off on each before finally moving on to the practical side of things. The instructor, one of the regular staff at the prison, introduces us to the extendable batons and gives us a rundown of how they work. It's not as exciting as it sounds, with these beauties not taking much to operate. Whilst they sit in their pouch at around 5 inches in length, a quick snap of the wrist brings them out to around 24 inches, just enough to swing this thing with conviction. As we line up and practice several deployments, my mind wanders to the inevitable next day and the final exam awaiting those that manage to pass today. It's not something I look forward to, but know only too well that without it, won't pass. It's not until after lunch that the real fun begins. This is where we are handed the reins of freedom, while our unfortunate instructor has the honor of dressing up in a red man suit, the fully protective covering to protect him from the ass-whooping about to be dished out. One at a time, we are called out and stand in the middle of the room. The red man prepares to attack, and we stand before him with nothing more than a 24-inch length of hope in our hands. It's not long before yours truly is called up. I stand for a moment and try to catch my thoughts as the instructor prepares his charge. As he advances, yelling abuse and obscenities, I take a stand, grab my baton, and begin to call for him to get back. Of course, he doesn't, but I continue to call for his retreat as I begin to methodically rain down hell on the pads of his legs until he drops in surrender. It's fun and a nice charge of adrenaline, but deep down, I know it's something I never want to need to do for real. The day ends once everyone is taken through several more final instructions. Despite trying their best to pass everyone, the instructors eventually cut 2 people from the course. One is unable to meet the standards needed to handle the baton. At one point, the officer grabs his baton, pulls it from the holster, and as he snaps it back, launches it into the ceiling. The second officer decides that he doesn't want to continue on, happy to call it quits before wasting any more time. The instructors accept his withdrawal, and we finish the day with 17 officers ready for the next day. Friday, February 15th. The day I'd been dreading for quite some time finally arrives, and I must say, my anxiety was quite peaked driving into the prison. The 17 of us quietly take our seats as we wait for the program to start, aware that the morning will most likely be filled with more theory. It turns out that there's just an hour or so of theory in its entirety, and that gives us quite a bit of time to learn about the different types of sprays, how to deploy them, and when to use them. It's another fun morning and really becomes interesting when we get to practice our newfound skills on a second instructor. He wears a gas mask and has a fake knife in his back pocket, as each of us is given a chance to experience a complete confrontation. It begins with us coming across a disorientated prisoner who's hunched over and appearing to be talking to himself. As the trainee calls out to him while maintaining a safe distance, the prisoner pretends to have an injury and calls for the officer to come closer. Of course he doesn't, and when the prisoner charges, cops several sprays to the face. Each trainee is given a different scenario, and my own was pretty straightforward. The instructor pretended to walk towards me, wanting to speak about a replacement uniform he needed. I know it's only role play, and I know he has a knife on him, but we all try our best to keep in the mindset of a real attack. I end up calling for him to drop the knife, to back off, and shoot off several bursts of spray when he doesn't comply. It's all pretty standard stuff, and while it takes up the entire morning, it's the afternoon I'm thinking about. As we break for lunch, we are given final instructions for the afternoon and given a last opportunity to withdraw. It's a loaded question, as withdrawal also means a fail, which on this occasion doesn't pull any volunteers. A friend and I head down to a local cafe and grab lunch, sitting quietly while we eat. Despite a little small talk, neither of us is in the mood for the food or the conversation, just wanting things to be done with already. Once back, we're immediately called behind the building where the instructors have set up 2 large tubs of water plus a running garden hose. We're given final instructions, then asked to pair up. Once we choose our partner, we form a single line, with our partners waiting for us next to the instructor. Okay, here we go. Ready? I watch each person before me go through the process, then prepare for my turn as I finally reach the front. I know this isn't going to be pleasant, but understand the reasons behind needing to experience it firsthand. Ready, Simon? I nod, stare directly into the eyes of the instructor, and watch as a small smile breaks out on his face. I swear I feel my butthole pucker several times with nerves and prepare for whatever's coming. He raises his hand, takes aim, and fires 2 blasts. For me, it was the end of life as I knew it. The first spray hit me across the forehead, whilst the second shoots directly into my eyes. The pain that tore into my eyeballs was unlike anything I had ever felt before. It was as if someone had ripped my eyelids back and held a naked flame against the eyeball itself. If someone had kicked me in the nuts at that point, I doubt I would have felt it. They could have nailed my balls to a board and had fire ants run over them, and I wouldn't have reacted. My face was on fire, my eyes burning with such ferocity that I barely felt my partner guiding me to the tub of water. "Drop to your knees," was all I heard, and I did. Felt the edge of the tub and dunked my head. At first, I simply held my eyes shut, but obviously the water did nothing. But when I opened them, a feat almost impossible at the time, I was shocked to find it did very little as well. It was as if the fire continued to burn underwater. I came up for air and heard someone mention the running hose. Once I stood, I felt my way towards the sound of people congregating around it and patiently waited my turn. It was only once I felt the water running across my open eyeballs that any relief came. But if you thought that's all it would take, guess again. The second I handed the hose to someone else, the torture returned, feeling like a nail file running across the delicate surface. My whole face felt on fire and waited for another go of the hose. It was all I could do. Eventually, there were half a dozen of us, each standing in a circle and handing the end of the hose back and forth. I swear I stood there for almost an hour before I felt courageous enough to walk more than a few feet from the circle, although returned a couple of times for another bathing. Eventually, we were led back inside and given a final debriefing, with most of us still fighting our way through the pain. But if you think that was funny, then you're in for a pleasant surprise. Once we were dismissed, I practically ran back to my car and hurried home. I don't know why, but for some reason, figured the pain mightn't follow me. It did, continuing to burn all the way home. Eventually, it did begin to recede, and I knew that I would never volunteer for such a stupid experience again. However, the excitement doesn't end there. My wife came home after her own workday, and when she greeted me, kissed the top of my head. After a few minutes, she returned to where I was sitting and asked, "Why are my lips tingling?" At 9 o'clock that night, I decided that I needed a shower to cleanse the day away, and this is where the story gets interesting. Do you realize that the spray itself remains on your person, and when it hits water, is reactivated? It's not long after I let the water start to run over me that I vaguely remember the instructor's final words which I now wished I remembered earlier. Make sure to wash your heads first in cold water before hopping in the shower. Whilst I felt the familiar sting resume on top of my head, it was the stinging on my balls that really got me worried. Firstly, because just before stepping into the shower, I scratched my head, then gave my nuts a scratch. I'm sorry, but it's what guys do. The burning downstairs continued well into the night, reminding me of the importance of paying attention. It was the only time I ever took that course, and I planned that as long as I live, will never put myself through that experience again. Saturday, February 16th. I really look forward to Saturday shifts, and this time find myself allocated to another unusual post, this one due to some ongoing night works. Because of the recent fire, electricians need to turn the power off for most of the night, leaving most of the units in the dark. Because this effectively cuts off their access to the emergency intercom, an officer needs to be present in each unit in case of trouble. But it's not just sitting in the unit that's required. No, that would be too easy. We also need to physically check each and every cell throughout the blackout to ensure everyone is safe and sound. Given the incredible diversity between the units, it is a virtual lottery when it comes to unit allocation. Whilst I have a definite list of units I don't want, there are a few I wouldn't mind and, thankfully, am allocated one of the latter. Glenelg East isn't too bad a unit, filled mostly with old tamps. A tamp is another word for pedophile, similar to rock spider. Tamp comes from the word tamper, as in an old man tampering with children. The unit is pretty quiet once I turn up, with the day staff sitting around the station. A few crooks walk around the common area, but for the most part, the majority have already called it a day and retired back into their cells. Two of the staff are new, off the same course as my recent partners, while one is Belle's husband. We shake, share a bit of banter, then start to prepare the unit for lockdown. It's a fairly clean unit and doesn't have the same aroma as most of the others. While it's not quite on the level of Yarn North, it's not one you'd complain about if assigned here. By the time Spiteri decides to call the crooks out for muster, there isn't a single one left out, all of them effectively tucked up. The old hand grabs the muster and gestures for one of the newbies to follow and lock the cells behind him. For me, it's as good a time as any to catch up on emails, especially since the power is due to go out soon. After 3 days' absence, I find close to 200, although the majority are nothing more than click and delete material. A couple I open and skim through, leaving the daily incident reports for last. Again, I find the majority of them made up of people either failing or refusing urine tests, a couple of prisoner-on-prisoner assaults, plus a few medical codes. There's only one real incident that grabs my immediate attention, and it's one listed for the 14th. The line reads that an officer was caught up in an altercation with a prisoner claiming poisoning. It's unusual in its description and doesn't contain the officer's name, just the prisoner's. "What happened with the poisoning?" I ask Spiteri once he returns from conducting count. "Oh, you haven't heard?" He half snickers as he grabs a seat to add up the numbers. "Give me a sec." Once he's added the final tally, he hands the board to the new officer that followed him and turns back to me. He whispers, doing his best to keep his voice from carrying across the unit. "You know Beryl?" "Smith?" I ask, and he nods. "Admitted to putting detergent into a crook's milk." "Wait, what?" I ask, in complete disbelief. I ran his words through my mind a second time, but still couldn't make sense of them. "Huh?" "Exactly. She looked him in the eye and told him she'd done it a couple of times. Got called up front and in the meeting admitted to the fact. I assumed she was canned. On the spot." "What the actual fuck?" I whispered, blown away. There's not a lot of things that surprise me anymore in this place, but that surprised me. No, shocked me is a better choice of words. I mean, that's not just a bad prank. It's a downright attempt to hurt someone. Control calls count correct and my evening begins, with the day staff gone in the blink of an eye. There's very little noise, and I'm sure that given the average age of the unit's tenants, most of them would be fast asleep. I decide to flick on the television while I still have a chance. Given that I would be without power for most of the night anyway, there's no real point to writing. It takes time and brain space to write at the best of times, and given the news I had just been given, plus not knowing of how much time I had left to use the computer, I figured it was time better spent watching something instead. There was an old James Bond movie playing, with Sean Connery playing the lead in You Only Live Twice. I always found that one to be one of my all-time favorites, probably because it had also been one of the first Bond movies I ever saw, back when I was around 12 or 13. By the time the movie finished, almost an hour later, I was surprised to find that we still had power. I know for a fact that a lot of extra staff were called in to man the rest of the units. That meant someone was paying a lot of money to have the work done at this specific time. I checked the time, saw it was almost 10, and wondered what was happening. Radio chatter had been fairly minimal, and I figured they may have kept all the work conversations on one of the other channels. The windows at the far end of the unit looked out over the unit's compound, but if I climbed up to the second tier, could get a good look across a decent portion of this side of the jail. I did just that, and once I pressed my hand against the glass, saw a decent gang of workers standing around in a half circle as a manager of some sort spoke to them. It must have been the preparation speech to get things underway. I remained watching for a few minutes, staring as the foreman waved his arms around, occasionally pointed to different units, then continued waving. Things got a bit tedious when a second person took center stage, followed by a third. I figured that the television was probably a better way to spend time, and thus I returned to my previous position. Up until that point, the intercoms were still diverted through to control. There was a tap on one of the cell doors a short time after I settled back into my chair, and I called out. No one answered until I walked closer to the doors and called out a second time. "Boss, can I grab some coffee, please?" "I don't drink coffee," I replied, not lying. It was a good try by the crook, but on this occasion didn't pay off. He doesn't answer, simply receding back into his own cell, just as I do to the station. It's not until after 11 that the power finally snaps off and I commence my checks a short time later. The majority of the unit's occupants are in fact sleeping, with only a couple sitting up in their beds, one of them staring out the window, no doubt imagining himself elsewhere or back in better times. I return to the station after my first complete round, switch off my torch, and sit in the darkness. The shadows soon start to fade out as my eyes adjust to the darkness. The irony of where I was sitting hits me, surrounded by the monsters that make up most people's nightmares. Here I was amongst them, sitting in darkness, with the horror of their crimes no doubt still playing through their minds. One could write a book about the experience, twisting it into something fictional with a significant amount of terror blended in. Perhaps it's one of my future projects. But for the time being, I absorbed the experience for what it is. Nothing more than an inconvenience in an otherwise normal shift. During my second lot of checks, the crook who'd been staring out the window previously had also given in to fatigue, now tucked up in his bed. It was his neighbor that was now awake and asking for some pain relief for a toothache. With no phone to help me, I make the call over the radio directly to the medical staff. The nurse turns up with her escort almost half an hour later and hands the prisoner his medication. I watch him take a swallow from his cup, check his mouth, and close the trap before thanking the nurse and the officer. The lights snap back on a little after 3, surprising me as I didn't expect them to return into the morning. That's what we were told to expect anyway, and it was a nice surprise to see them come alive much earlier. It gave me a few hours to write, and I didn't waste a moment. Why would I? There was very little else to do, and late-night television was normally filled with infomercials, bad enough to slam you with tiredness. The rest of the shift went by quite quickly once I lost myself in the words I was typing. They flowed so easily, and I managed to complete 2 complete chapters of a Sam Rader novel. I loved writing her stories, and to think I was writing them whilst in this place is a little crazy to think about. The first of the day staff turn up almost 5 minutes before morning muster, apparently caught up in the line of staff trying to get in on a Sunday morning. I don't mind. What's 5 minutes between friends? Sunday, February 17th. It turns out that the workers from the previous night didn't manage to get through their required workload and left a few things for tonight. I'm given the go-ahead to return to Glen Elg East, as it is one of the 4 units that need switching off again. I'm hopeful that the power is only off for a few hours, just as it was the previous night. As I walk through the prison, I sense a certain lull in the air, something weighing on the minds of the officers I pass on my way to the unit. Although I greet a few, it's not until I see my friend Chris that I find out the latest. Jack Henderson got stabbed. Oh fuck, how is he? The words hit me like a ton of bricks. Although Jack isn't someone I go out of my way to see, he's still an officer and one I've worked with on a few occasions. He's at the hospital. They say he'll be fine, but it happened in one of the long corridors between cameras. Jack simply heading to one of the units to relieve someone for lunch. He was a general duties officer for the day, requiring him to serve several roles, including lunch relief. He was walking towards the row of units including Thompson East and West when a prisoner jumped him coming the other way. He stabbed him more than a dozen times, including the arm, shoulder, back, stomach, and leg. It happened in one of the few blind spots, with no cameras capturing the attack. It was Jack's shouts that caught the attention of other officers who came running. By the time they reached him, he was bleeding profusely, although still fighting back. The attacker was brought to the ground and dragged to admissions, eventually taken to another prison where he would be questioned by police. Jack was taken to the hospital by ambulance and underwent surgery shortly after. For me, the worst part, aside from the attack itself, is the lack of publicity. The news had exactly zero mention, and the other officers only found out about it via word of mouth. Jack was almost killed, stabbed a dozen times during the course of his duty, and there wasn't a mention of it anywhere. Hindsight is a beautiful thing, because what I can tell you is that the day after the attack, 2 prisoners climb onto the roof of one of the units and cause several $1,000s worth of damage by pulling a few outlet vents free, break an air conditioner unit, and smash a few skylights. The point is, the news helicopter was in the air for footage within a few minutes of the phone call from whomever leaked the information. That vision was seen on almost every news network, yet a single mention of an officer laying his life on the line and suffering a horrendous attack gets nothing. I'm sorry for venting. It's not what I tend to do in these books. But when it's so clear what type of information they prefer, it shows what kind of world we live in. So many people put their lives on the line every day across the world in order to try and keep us safe. And I just want to give them all a nod of appreciation right here. Thank you for the work you do. Anyway, I eventually arrive at Glen Elk East and listen to another rundown of the stabbing from the staff there. Everyone is quite shocked, and I know that it will be enough for 1 or 2 officers to call it quits. While the threat of attack is something hanging above us all the time, it's different when it actually happens, or you know the person it happens to. It's not long before control calls count correct, and the day shift officers bid me a good night. I wave, watch them leave, and jump on the computer, keen to get through as much writing as possible before lights out. As if Murphy's Law had somehow followed me into the unit, the power disappears less than an hour into my shift, leaving me with another shift in the dark. But instead of spending my time sitting in the station and staring at shadows, I instead grab a chair, carry it up to the second tier, and sit in front of the upstairs windows. From there, I see across the prison, the night sky, plus a few city lights in the distance. Whilst I can't quite make out the stars in the sky, the view is enough for me to gaze and let my mind go, instantly filling with thoughts and ideas for current and future writing. My mind returns to Jack several times, and I wish for his speedy recovery. The night passes without incident, with no codes called throughout it. I complete my rounds with zero fanfare, all of the prisoners passed out on their beds, with only the sounds of an occasional cough or bed fart to keep me occupied. I'm thankful when the first rays of sunshine fly through the window, with my eyes weary from a night of nothingness. The power is only restored a half hour before the shift change and doesn't offer me anything in the way of passing time. By then, it's too late. Thankfully, I have a few nights off, and as I walk out of the prison, bid my farewell to those I pass, wishing them a safe shift. Thursday, February 21st. It's a stormy Thursday evening when I return to the prison for the start of another couple of shifts. Tonight, I have the honor of sitting in reception for the very first time. I say first time because due to the fire, it's a temporary mobile building, like one of those building site mobile offices. The beauty of working in this place is that it starts an hour early, which means I also get to leave an hour earlier in the morning. Shortly after my arrival, 2 of the remaining reception staff finished their shift, leaving just me and a single other. That person continues until the rest of the prison finish, leaving me alone to guard the front door. It's not long before the night shift officers begin to arrive in dribs and drabs, and I process each together with Michelle, the other staff member. While she runs the bags through the X-ray machine, I give each officer a swipe over with the handheld metal detector. It's a simple enough process. With each officer standing before me with their arms held out, I carefully run the wand over them from side to side and top to bottom, then get them to turn around before I repeat the process. Each person takes less than a minute to complete, and we return to our previous chat afterwards. It was while we were in between processing people that a random woman walks into the room, looking quite animated. "I am here to pick up my stuff." Michelle turned, looking at her curiously. "Pick up your boyfriend's stuff?" "No, mine. I just got released from court and need to grab my stuff." Michelle stood and went to the counter. "This is the men's prison. You need to head over to the women's prison up the road." "No, from here. My stuff is here." I could already see that the woman wasn't going to listen. "No, it won't be here. This is the men's." "But the driver told me I had to get off at this prison." That's when it dawned on us. "What driver?" Michelle asks. "The bus driver. He told me this was the women's jail." "He dropped you at the wrong prison. You need to jump back on the bus and continue on up the road." It appeared as if the driver, keen to get the woman off his bus for whatever reason, had lied to her and then dumped her on our doorstep. Thankfully, she didn't put up a fight and simply turned back to the door and left. Michelle looked at me, rolled her eyes, and shook her head. There's never a dull moment. "Anyway," she began, reaching for her bag, "time for this chicken to get home." I bid her a good night just as another night shift officer walks in. It doesn't take much to process her, and I make small talk during the short process. Just as we finish, I hear control call count correct and stand back as day shift immediately begin to flood through one door and disappear out the other. Several greetings fly my way as I try to return everybody's waves and good nights. It's a virtual tsunami, the rush and excited chatter as the flood of staff wash through the small room. There's nothing to do but stand back on high ground and watch it pass by. It's only once the final wave passes through that I climb back down to ground level and retake my place behind the counter. Just as I switch on the computer to catch up on things, one of the female staff pops her head back inside. "There's a woman out here saying she's taken something and needs an ambulance." I groan, already sure of who the person is. I pop my head out through the doorway and see her sitting by one of the cars, her back against the wheel. "What's the matter?" I ask. She looks up at me, a distant gaze in her eyes as she looks through me. "I've taken something and need an ambulance." "Great," I mutter under my breath. "Can you walk?" the other officer asks, and the woman nods. "Let's get you back inside." I lead the way and once back in reception, phone the duty supervisor with the news. While speaking with her, one of the day managers walks through the door, gives me a wave, then sees the woman sitting on the row of chairs. The other officer walks over and gives him a brief rundown, and he gestures for me to drop the phone. "It's okay. Tell Wendy I'll take care of it." I do as asked, then hang up as the manager takes over and phones an ambulance himself. He sits beside the woman and tries to get as much information as possible, although there's not a lot forthcoming. The paramedics arrive almost 10 minutes after the call, and the woman is still sitting on her chair when they walk in. It doesn't take long for them to treat her and load the woman into the back of their ambulance. The shock comes through a few minutes later when the manager returns into the room. He followed the paramedics out to the ambulance, getting information for his report, and learned the full story. Just as she had said, the woman had been released from custody at court only a few hours before. She had caught a train out of the city and hopped off a few suburbs over to buy drugs. The guy she saw on the platform did indeed have some, but rather than simply take her money, he also raped the woman behind one of the station buildings. She had popped the pill as a way of dealing with the pain. I was stunned by the news. It's not hard to pass judgment on someone from nothing more than their appearance. As I watch the ambulance pull away, I feel ashamed of myself that I assumed to know her situation. Sometimes, it's these very lessons that teach us along our own journey, are they not? Once the manager bids me a good night, there's only another 2 or 3 staff that pass out, and before long, I lock the front door. There's just a changeover of nursing staff later in the evening, plus the random vehicle patrols that happen, which I can now perform thanks to the weapons course I finished. For company, I have the television, plus the computer, and I use both throughout the night. Shortly after 11, I let the final nurse out through the front door, watch her walk safely to her car, then lock myself back in. The night passes quite quickly, thanks to a few duties I need to perform, including a report, some cleanup, as well as the newspapers when they arrive the next morning, which I slip into unit bags as per the list. All up, it's a pretty cruise night, and I'm happy to see my relief walk in almost 30 minutes early. She happily sends me on my way, and I gladly accept the early mark. The great thing is, I'm back in here tonight, and that's something I'm actually looking forward to. Friday, February 22nd. I return for a second night in reception and am once again greeted by Michelle. It has been a fairly ordinary day, and apart from one visitor kicking off because they were found to test high for a narcotic during a routine swab, everything else was as per normal. As we wait for time to pass, I retell the story of the woman from the previous night, and Michelle listens in disbelief as I tell her about the suspected rape and the paramedics taking her away. She is just as surprised as I was, and I can see her disbelief at our own judgment of the woman. It's not long after I finish that the first of the night shift officers start to walk in, and we process each in turn as they roll up. Before I know it, I stand back and watch the usual nightly flood pour in through one door and out the other in a cloud of excited banter and well wishes, before finally standing in the doorway and peering out over a fast emptying parking lot. The sun drops over the horizon as I close the door and prepare for another night of the usual duties, the first of which is to read mail. All mail that enters the prison must be carefully screened, and I mean each and every piece. Want to know what we find in the mail? Everything, and I mean everything. Drugs, blades, syringes, USBs, pornographic material, instructions for assaults and standovers, plus numerous other things. The first line of defense are the drug detection dogs that pass over each and every envelope and parcel. But that's not where it ends, as it takes an actual pair of eyes to sort through the bundles a piece at a time. And the person employed to do that? The night shift officer who's working reception. Me. I open each envelope carefully after putting on gloves, then slowly open the contents. Most of the time, it's simply folded letters, filled with news from home or even another prison. Some have the scent of perfume inside them, whilst others have photos from home. My job is to check each and every piece. Drugs could be attached to them, sometimes in powder form, or even embedded in the actual paint of a child's drawing once dissolved in the liquid. There really are no barriers to how people try and smuggle things in. But while you might think it's exciting work, guess again. After half a dozen letters, you quickly learn that most of the letters contain nothing more than ramblings, most of the time so riddled with typos that it makes reading a near impossibility. There are lots of photos, and sadly, a lot of baby photos sent in by the mothers left holding them when their partner is incarcerated. The messages of hope, despair, anger, and frustration affect you, and it's not long before I loathe opening another and another and another. Although I take a few breaks here and there, the mail takes me through until almost 2 in the morning. Whilst there was none the previous night, tonight more than made up for it. In all honesty, it's probably one of the worst jobs I've ever had to do, and I'm more than grateful as I open the final one, see that it's just a couple of photos on their own, and quickly shove them back into the envelope and then into the bag. It's not much of an exciting shift to share, with me just fluffing about for the final few hours. Once the newspapers arrive, I sort them into their respective unit bags and line them up, ready for staff to grab them on their way through. Morning staff began to show shortly after 5, and I process each of them in turn, taking turns with x-raying their bags, followed up with a quick wave of the wand. With only a trickle of people walking in, it's enough for one person to handle. My relief shows up 20 minutes early, and again, I'm given the option to leave early. Not one to pass up another opportunity, I grab my gear and take my exit, wishing everyone a great day. Monday, February 25th. I was due to work as a patrol officer tonight, but wasn't feeling the best when I woke up. Instead, I decided to utilize a sick day and remain home to deal with it. There's not a lot I want to do with a headache, and thus remain in bed for the night. Strangely enough, I get a return call from the soup a few minutes after my call, and am asked whether I'd be up for some fire training the next day. They had someone pull out, and given that I wasn't working tonight, it might be a good chance for me to take the empty chair. Although I'm rostered on for another patrol shift tomorrow night, the soup agrees to make the necessary changes. Training and keeping qualifications up to date is a priority for the training department. Sometimes it's quite difficult to try and get enough people into specific courses, some of which require annual renewal, such as firefighting. I happily accept and hope my headache goes before then. Tuesday, February 26th. Sadly, my headache remained and I had quite a bad night. But as I had my name down for the training, have no real choice but to attend. I try to dose myself up with painkillers before I go, plus grab the largest water bottle I can. If there's one thing I know, it's that drinking plenty of water is sometimes all that's needed to beat an illness. There are 20 officers all up in the training, and the day begins with a brief roll call, followed by an hour of theory. It's amazing how much you forget over the course of a year, and I listen intently, as the instructors are quite knowledgeable and offer a lot of hints and tips along the way. Just as there always is, we take a brief break, followed by the usual movie session. This is where they show us some of the recent unit fires from across the prison system, plus, more importantly, how they were dealt with. Not all of them were dealt with successfully, with some creating more drama by not following procedure. I do my best to try and stay on top of the mind-numbing pain in my head and load up on a few more painkillers. Don't get me wrong, I hardly ever take tablets. I mean, I don't even drink coffee. But on this occasion, I just needed to try anything to get me through the day. Once we finished going through the video footage of half a dozen incidents, we break for lunch, and I take the opportunity to just sit in the corner with my eyes closed. It helps, and together with the water I'd been drinking throughout the morning, eventually break through to the other side. By the time we regroup after lunch, I feel much better and hardly detect any pain. It's a good thing, because once we go through donning the breathing tank and mask, we head outside for some real firefighting. Every unit houses oxygen tanks and masks, and every officer must know how to put them on and use them accordingly. The reality is, unit fires happen, especially when prisoners try to manipulate the system. Believe it or not, but some prisoners are that dumb that they light a fire in a room they cannot escape from. Think about that for a moment. Each officer takes the small test in turn, partnering up with a helper before going through the sequence of wearing the tank and working through the specific points in order to prepare to enter a building fire. Only once everyone passes do we head outside and hit the fire pit. A bunch of extinguishers await us at the back of the building, and once the instructor lights several types of fires, we attack each of them in turn, using a different variety of extinguisher in the process. It's fun, but also quite serious work. It's crucial to understand the difference between an oil fire, electrical fire, and a standard fire. Use the wrong extinguisher, and it could leave you dead. The day finishes with each of us tasked with a final test to grab an extinguisher and kill an oil fire. Using a foam extinguisher, I aim the nozzle slightly above the flames and let the foam fall over the fire, blanketing the oil beneath and subsequently suffocating the flames. Everyone passes, and once the last of the crew finish their task, we spend the final few minutes wrapping up the day. It's another month done for me, and my mind wanders back over the previous few weeks to all the incidents that made up my working environment. But as I bid the team a good night and head back to my car, I wonder what encounters still await me. The unpredictability of the prison always at the forefront of my mind.